Your goal by the end of the period today is to use imagery or descriptive language to create a setting in writing. Imagery is one of the most important tools writers use to create an experience for the reader. Writers create imagery by using sensory details, words and phrases that use the five senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. I've put a picture of a beach scene here, and if I want to create the experience of being there for a reader, I need to help the reader have the sensations they would feel if they were there. I need the reader to see the petal pink and coral clouds fade to gray, to feel the warmth drain away as the sun sinks slowly below the horizon and the water deepens into blue-black, to feel the breeze pick up, raising goosebumps on their skin, which is tight from salt and sand and midday sun, to hear the palm fronds rustle and clack, to hear the restless susurrus of the waves, to smell the tang of kelp and taste the salt on their tongue. Using details related to all five senses helps the reader have the experience of being there. Let's look at how published authors use imagery to make a setting come alive. Our first mentor text is an excerpt from Audacity by Melanie Crowder. The main character is an immigrant girl living in New York at the beginning of the last century. She works at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory right before the fire. But this excerpt is just about her home. New York is crowded and dirty, and she lives in poor conditions in an apartment building called a tenement. Here she's describing a moment of respite from her grim life. Sunlight. There is a small space wide as a horse-drawn cart between the buildings where we live and the one behind it. Just before noon, before the sun has reached its highest point, that space fills with light and warmth. The tenement empties like sand spilling out of a broken jar. The alley swarms with children. Women bring their piecework and sit, their faces tilted up to catch the sun as it filters through the silted city air. In under an hour, it's gone again, slipped past the edge of the next building like an egg yolk sliding out of the shell. I've gone through and I highlighted a lot of the visual imagery that Melanie Crowder uses here to create the experience of being in New York. And I've noticed that she does it with adjectives, with vivid action verbs, with figurative language, and by some comparisons. So for example, up here I noticed that she's used the adjective small to describe the space, but she's also told me how small. It's as wide as a horse-drawn cart. This is a time when the alleyways were filled with horses and carts, and the fact that the alley's only as big as the cart shows that it's super crowded there. Before the sun has reached its highest point, the space fills with light and warmth. So warmth is a touch or feeling sensation. The rest of it's just about visual imagery of light. She describes the tenement as emptying like sand spilling out of a broken jar. Here I can picture the residents of the tenement spilling forth. They're like grains of sand, and they're spilling out of a broken jar. To me, by saying that the residents are like grains of sand, it's showing they're kind of small and insignificant, and describing the tenement as a broken jar shows how kind of decrepit and broken it is. But the alley swarms with children. Swarms is a verb that makes me think of bees. I can see the children running around with all kinds of frenetic energy in this brief moment. The women sit with their faces tilted up. That's a very specific description. I can picture how their faces are angled. She describes the sun as it filters through the silted city air. Silted means it's full of sediment and grime and dust, and that's why the sun is having to filter through it. I can picture little motes of dust in the sun's rays. Finally, she describes the sun as slipping past the edge of the next building like an egg yolk sliding out of a shell. Here's another simile where she's comparing the sun to something very unlike it, an egg yolk, but I can see it as perfect and orange and round and just slipping away with that verb sliding. So in the space of an hour, I can really see how this small, crowded space suddenly becomes alive with activity and then becomes quiet again. This scene doesn't really advance the plot at all. It's not about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, but it gives me a very good sense on how the environment affects my character and how life in this crowded place really feels. I've selected another text, Stella by Starlight by Sharon Draper. In this text, Stella and her brother Jojo are awake and outside in the middle of the night. Chapter 1, Flames Across the Water. 9 robed figures dressed all in white, heads covered with softly pointed hoods. Against the black of night, a single wooded cross blazed. Reflections of peppery red flame shimmered across the otherwise dark surface of Kilkenny Pond. 2 children, crouched behind the low-hanging branches of a hulking oak tree on the other side of the pond, watched the flickers of scarlet in the distance in fearful silence. Dressed only in nightshirts, Stella Mills and her brother Jojo shivered in the midnight October chill. Stella yanked the boy close, dry leaves crunching beneath his bare feet. "Shh," she whispered, holding him tightly. "Don't move." Jojo squirmed out of her grasp. "It was me that saw him first," he protested. "You'd still be asleep if I hadn't come and got you, so let me see." Stella covered her brother's lips with her fingers to quiet him. Even though her toes were numb with cold and she knew they needed to get out of there, she could not take her eyes from the horror glimmering toward them from across the pond. "Do you know what would happen if they saw us?" she whispered, shifting her stinging feet, the crushing of dry leaves seeming far too loud. Jojo pressed himself closer to her in answer. Besides the traitorous leaves, Stella could hear a pair of bullfrogs were whooping to each other, but nothing, not a single human voice from across the pond. She could, however, smell the charring pine, tinged with what? She sniffed deeper. It was acrid, harsh. Kerosene. A trail of gray smoke snaked up to the sky, merging with the clouds. "Who are they?" Jojo whispered, stealing another glance. "The clan." Just saying those words made Stella's lips quiver. "The Ku Klux Klan. Here. Here. What are they doing?" "Practicing, I think." "For what?" Stella paused and smoothed his bushy hair, trying to figure out the best way to answer. Jojo was only 8. "Nothing good," she said at last. So again, I've gone through and looked at some of the imagery and kind of color-coded it: yellow for seeing, green for hearing, and blue for touching or feeling. At the beginning, there's a lot of very strong visual imagery. She uses numbers, like 9 robed figures, to see how many there are. She describes their heads are covered with soft, pointy hoods, so she's describing the shape of things. She's describing a lot of colors. They're dressed in white against the black of night, and the reflections of peppery red flames shimmered across the dark surface. So we have black and white and red and black again, and that contrast is very vivid. We also have a lot of very clear actions we can see. The children are crouched. Stella yanked. Jojo squirmed. Stella covered. And of course, she whispered. So that really helps me visualize what's going on. We see again here that the flickers of scarlet reappear here in the second paragraph. And we also see in the first paragraph where she talked about flames shimmering, down here in the bottom paragraph on this page, she talks about the horror glimmering toward them from across the pond. So she's echoing the shimmering of the flames down here again without being repetitive, because she's changing shimmering to glimmering. I notice she's doing the same thing with some sound imagery. We talk about fearful silence. She talks about the dry leaves crunching. We have some onomatopoeia here where she actually describes the sound of the whispering, shh. And while she talked about the dry leaves crunching up here down at the bottom of the paragraph, it's changed to the crushing of dry leaves seeming far too loud. Finally, we have some feel and touch imagery. Jojo shivered in the midnight October chill. He has bare feet. Stella's toes were numb with cold, and she has stinging feet. Overall, the contrast between the fire and light imagery, the red hot flames, and then the chill and the cold, that contrast creates a lot of tension in the scene. On the next page, there's some more sound imagery. Stella could hear the pair of bullfrogs burping to each other. Burp. And so that's some onomatopoeia. That's why it's in italics there. But that contrasts with not a single human voice from across the pond. We also have our first example of some smell imagery. She could smell the charring pine tinged with, she can't identify it with what. And she sniffs it again, and there's a really bitter, irritatingly strong taste or smell, harsh, and it's kerosene that they've used to light the cross on fire with. And finally, she ends with another visual image of the trail of gray smoke snaked up to the sky. That snake just kind of an implied metaphor as it's curling up like a snake. The scene continues without much description, with a lot of dialogue though, and the dialogue sets up what the conflict is. The clan is here, and so Stella and her family face potential threats, intimidation, possibly even violence from the clan. So this scene that they're encountering is used to show how Jojo and Stella are reacting to the environment, but more importantly to set up one of the primary conflicts in the story. Your task today is to create a flash draft using imagery to create a setting. Write your flash draft in the grammar and craft section of your notebook. Try to use lots of imagery or sensory detail. Try to use all 5 senses. Remember, writers use adjectives like colors, shapes, and sizes, verbs or concrete actions, and figurative language, similes and metaphors, to create imagery. Try to use the description to show how the setting influences the character and/or show how the setting is creating a conflict for the character. You might also want to establish a mood or atmosphere with the setting. Hint, think first, is your scene idyllic, perfect, or does trouble lurk there? How does your character feel there? It would be great if you came up with your own scene. You may write about anything. However, if you need a prompt, try one of these. The streets were dark, except for the dim greenish light of 2 or 3 street lamps. Wind whistled through empty alleyways and rustled leaves into the gutters. I looked at my map again. Or the cafeteria scene. As I walked into the lunchroom, go.